The subject we are covering today is social isolation and the Bhagavad Gita. All of us are being subject to enforced social isolation. This is one of the tragedies of COVID, that all of us are being socially isolated, and we are being socially isolated not by choice, but we have been subject to social isolation as a result of regulation, health regulation. In order to protect us from being afflicted with COVID. But I'd like to tell you that social isolation can be as bad or perhaps even worse than being afflicted with COVID, especially the mild forms, which today are perhaps more prevalent than the severe forms. To be socially isolated is like being put into solitary confinement. And in prisons all over the world, the practice of solitary confinement, of social isolation, of secure housing units, of administrative or disciplinary segregation, all these are similar names for this one thing, which is being socially isolated from the rest of your kind. All of these exist in prison systems around the world. And there are very active and aggressive people who value mental health, who are opposing this and pressuring governments to change their policies of incarceration or imprisonment. And yet, just look at it. Whether or not you like it, we are all subject to social isolation. But social isolation is itself a disease. And social isolation itself causes disease. And you might wonder why this is so. And the answer is very simple. Man is a social animal. All other mammals, you will find, are capable of moving and protecting themselves from the moment they are born. Giraffes give birth and the baby giraffe runs after the mother. Deer gives birth and the baby deer runs behind the mother. But it is the human child, the human infant, which perhaps for more than 4 or 5 years is unable to even make out how to protect itself, forget about running. And in this period of time of infancy and young childhood, the child has to connect with the social structure around it, so that the social structure around the infant will protect the infant and raise the infant. There is a whole school of psychology which is known as social psychology, which indicates how important connections with other people are for your mental and physical well-being. If you take a single cell of the body and you do not allow it to connect with any other cell around it, no matter what nutrients you might put around it, there is a tendency for this cell to undergo death in the form of what we call as apoptosis. Similarly, for the human being, when he is isolated from those who are around him or her, this individual is more than likely to undergo a whole host of diseases that might lead to its eventual demise. Today, we understand what isolation does to the human mind and to the human body, because we have forced examples in terms of prisoners who have been imprisoned, who are kept in all these fancy sounding names of security housing unit, Anda cell, who have been kept in what we call as administrative or disciplinary segregation. The real name is solitary confinement. And putting somebody in solitary confinement, let me assure you, is seen by many as being worse than being condemned to death. Because with death, people see an end. But a person who is subject to solitary confinement continues to suffer mentally and physically for the entire duration of his imprisonment. And my friends, that's not enough. These effects of solitary confinement, of social isolation, continue to cause mental and physical disease years after they are over, many years after they are over. What are these? And you might be experiencing some of them right now. Have you noticed that you or people around you who are socially isolated are becoming irritable? Have you noticed that people around you, or perhaps you, are appearing distracted? Have you noticed that people who are socially isolated are finding difficulty in sleeping at night? For difficulty in sleeping at night is one of the first flags, first signs of mental disorder and mental disease. Have you found or have you observed that social isolation is causing other mental disorders? The first disorders it is known to cause are affective disorders. And by affective disorders, we mean those disorders that are anxiety. And this anxiety may appear like anxiety, but becomes anxiety disorder. People who are socially isolated are more likely and inclined to get panic disorder. You may get what we call a simple sadness or dysthymia, but it can easily extend in social isolation to what we know as depression. Not only depression, but depression can become very bad. And it can become bad enough for the person to consider self-harm. And therefore, suicidal tendencies are also increased in people who are subject to social isolation. In social isolation, you are also more inclined to experience paranoia. to hearing voices, to moving into psychosis. And if anybody has got a dormant mental disorder that is waiting to take birth, this person with this dormant mental disorder will find that it will become manifest in periods of social isolation. This social isolation is also a form of post-traumatic disorder, because isolation is itself a trauma. And this soon leads to physical disorders. Are you getting more headaches than you used to? Are you getting more migraines than you used to? Have you found that you are suffering from hypertension? Or has your hypertension increased in this period of lockup and isolation? There are digestive disturbances that occur as well. Your immune system gets depressed because there is a psychoneuroimmunological link. In fact, it's called a system. Psychoneuroimmunological system. And consequently, if your immune system is depressed, you are not less likely, but you are more likely to contract COVID. These, my friends, are just some of the unfortunate side effects of being socially isolated. All over the world, reformers are fighting to change prison systems and allow for people to be let out of these secure housing units, the segregation into solitary cells, which is a form of social isolation. And the effects of the lockdown and the solitary social isolation that occurs, you put on your television set and you will watch any news channel which is international, and you will find people from around the world, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in Europe, whether it is in the United States. People are rebelling against the restrictions that the government is imposing on them for the sake of protecting their own health. So the government is insisting on social isolation all over the world, and people are experiencing this as a far greater health hazard, as a far greater psychological and even physical illness. And people are coming out onto the streets. They are protesting, and some of them are even rioting against the restrictions that have been imposed. So this is the tragedy of social isolation. But my friends, I'd like to share with you that we can look at it from the other side. We can look at it from the side of spiritual awakening. We can look at it from the side of the Bhagavad Gita. And we can see how we can make use of social isolation for our spiritual advancement. In the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, text 69, Krishna says, Ya nisha sarva bhutanam tasyam jagarti samyami. Yasyam jagrati bhutani ya nisha pashyato munihi. What is night for all beings is the time of awakening for the self-control. And the time of awakening for all beings, that is daytime, is night for the introspective sage. So what is great for human beings? To be socially connected, to move around, to be free, to connect, to socially interact. This is considered great for human beings and has got great psychological advantages. And in fact, it's a psychological necessity. But for those who are trying to transcend that mind, those who are trying to extinguish or annihilate that mind, those who are making efforts to surrender that mind, those who have realized that this mind is the source of all suffering, for such people, what is considered to be psychologically harmful for other people may actually be a blessing for those who are progressing and desiring success in their spiritual lives. The Bhagavad Gita very clearly in chapter 13 points out that the characteristic of a person who is in knowledge is that he withdraws from excessive association with even his family. Asaktir anabhishvangah putra dara grihadishu nityam cha samachitatvam ishtanishta papatishu. So he is withdrawn and he's not excessively attached to or excessively associating with even his wife and his son. On the other hand, in the same chapter, Krishna says, Maicha ananya yogena bhakti ravya vicharani vivikta desha sevitvam aratir jana samshadi. So Krishna actually says that such a person who is in knowledge with undeviating, undistracted devotional service to me, such a person living in a solitary place, vivikta desha, in a solitary place, without attachment or association with people in general, this person of knowledge lives. This is very clear. Vivikta desha sevitvam aratir jana samshadi. Similarly, in the 18th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, in text 52, Krishna also points out and says, Vivikta sevi lagvasi yata vakkaya manasa dhyana yoga paronityam vairagyam samupashrita. He is describing here the realized soul, and he describes the realized soul as one who lives in a solitary or secluded place, who eats little, who controls the body and tongue, is always in trance and is detached. So what is this state where the person does not associate excessively with people around him and in fact chooses social isolation? For those who have taken to the order of renunciation, external renunciation, a state which Krishna does not recommend, because Krishna clearly says in the Bhagavad Gita, Sanyasastu mahavao dukkham aptuma yogatah. Krishna says that to take that path of total social isolation is a path that brings only sorrow unless you have already attained spiritual realization and union with God. But you find people all over this subcontinent who are renouncing the world, leaving their parents, abandoning their wives and families, joining monasteries, joining temples, going into the forests and into the mountains. They are in fact seeking social isolation. And if you go to some of the monasteries, you will find that these monasteries have cells which are completely without any sensorial stimulation. And monks are lowered into these cells, and food is lowered to them, and their excrement is taken out similarly. And they live there completely socially isolated for weeks, months, some even years at a time, with the idea of seeking to annihilate, to extinguish, to transcend, to surrender the mind. For indeed, it is your mind that is your own enemy. You have no other enemy in this world except the mind. To keep the mind alive, you need social interaction. When you voluntarily choose to transcend the mind, to extinguish the mind, to surrender the mind, periods of social isolation are useful. From time to time, even for people who live in the world, for people who are in fact, shall we say, householders, like you and me, it is recommended that from time to time people engage in what is known as spiritual retreats. A spiritual retreat is where you actually withdraw from social contact and you find time for contemplation. You find time for prayer and connection with God. You find time to remember God and forget yourself. And aha, this is the secret of spiritual life which I'm giving you. Remember God and forget yourself. And my friends, even if you can't remember God, even if you don't want to remember God, if you forget yourself, you will be in connection with God because there is nothing else. Yourself is the only thing that stands between you and God. The self, which is the fictitious creation of your mind, based upon the experience that this body has had in the past. In the past in this life, and in the past in the lives that have brought you to this life. So all that you have to do is to move the self aside and you will be in touch with God. All you have to do is to transcend the self, surrender the self, and you will be in touch with God. And you will get clear experiences, not the crazy experiences that people talk about, but even acceptable experiences that have been validated scientifically. And one of these experiences is known as depersonalization and derealization. When you lose that sense of self, you begin to feel disconnected and detached from the self. You appear to be an outside observer of your own thoughts or body. In fact, without trying to become a Sakshi, you become a Sakshi. People are standing in front of you and abusing you to your face. And you are actually standing apart and observing yourself being abused. And therefore, you are not reacting. You look upon the world as if you're looking up at this world through a thick glass. Events that cause other people pain and anguish, especially psychological pain and anguish, are not experienced by you with the same intensity. It's as if you're observing the world with anesthesia. The world indeed appears unreal to you. And this world appears unreal to you because there is no emotional connect with the world. So the loss of self is called depersonalization. And the appearance of the world as a dream is known as derealization. And all of us at some time or the other have experienced or will experience it, even naturally without spiritual endeavor. Anyone who has been subject to emotional abuse and neglect in childhood, people who have been subject to significant stress in their work, in their career, in their studies, even people who have had panic attacks, and the unfortunate ones who enter into forbidden drug use. If you have ever landed in a strange new place for the first time, as you descend from the aircraft, you will feel a sense of detachment. All this you will get in spades. All this you will get with greater intensity, you will be detached. With greater intensity, you will see this world as unreal. With the dissolution of self. So remember God and forget self. And nothing helps that as does 3 proven scientific methods for bringing about altered states of consciousness. One is called sensorial deprivation. When you can close your eyes and shut your ears to all external sound. When you can lose your focus from the sensations of your body and bring that attention within yourself. This sensorial deprivation, this social isolation, your sense of self is nothing but a creation of your social interactions. You are a father, you are a mother, you are a brother, you are a son, you are a co-worker, you are an employee, or you are a professional, and people relate to you in these identities. And all these identities and all these social interactions coalesce to form the sense of self. And by being socially isolated, to prevent yourself from going crazy, you keep your mind occupied by chanting God's name. You keep your mind occupied by chanting God's name. And this will also interrupt the repeated reinforcement of the sense of self that occurs with the wandering mind. Your wandering mind is constantly reconstructing and recreating your sense of self. When you're socially isolated and you chant the name of God constantly, Kirtaniya Sadahari, you will become very quickly, you will progress to being and experiencing what spirituality is about. So, my request to all of you is that yes, social isolation is harmful. But no, it does not need to be harmful to you. Do not allow it to harm you. Use it instead as a way to progress in life. Every material opportunity for suffering is a spiritual opportunity for growth. And therefore, use this social isolation which occurs as an opportunity to remember God and forget self. In addition to your work, which must continue regardless, as an offering to God with love and devotion, you must use your recreational time not in entertaining yourself with electronic media, but use that opportunity to chant God's name and further bring about dissolution of the self. And very soon, without doubt, you will quickly experience that state of being Sthita Prajna, of being a yogi, of being a bhakta, of being a gunatita. Therefore, I request all of you to perform all your duties which are paramount in a spirit of sacrifice and devotion to this all-pervading Lord. For through it you will get peace, perfection, and the supreme destination. Yata pravrittir bhutanam yena sarvam idam tatam swakarmana abhyarchaya siddhim vindati manavaha. And also, when you are not working, which is your primary means, your work as a sacrifice for God is the primary means for attaining Him, use the time to chant God's name. I recommend the chanting of the Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, for 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening. If you take a bead mala of 108, it will be roughly amounting to 16 malas in the morning, 16 malas in the evening. You will not get such an opportunity in your life. This is the time when you can use this adversity of social isolation for your spiritual progress. Does anyone have any questions?
Yes, sir. Hi, morning. I'm just trying to. Yes. So can you hear me, sir?
Yes.
Okay. So, sir, we of course are getting a lot of questions on the lines of, it's a tough time, and how should one remain positive during these times? And of course, I think you've partially answered those questions also in the session. But if you want to add to anything that you've said in terms of staying positive and getting your hopes, being in good spirits and things like that.
People foolishly think that when things are negative, think positive. This is total rubbish and bullshit. Excuse my language. It is not about being positive. It is about being immune to the negative and the positive. It is about transcending the negative and the positive. It is about becoming unaffected by negative and unaffected by positive. Dukheshu anudvignamana sukheshu vigata spriha vita raga bhaya krodha sthitadi muni uchyate. It is about being undisturbed, undepressed when there's cause for sorrow. It's also about becoming equanimous, not excited when there's cause for joy. Being free from attachment, fear, and anger, such is the sage of steady wisdom. Jitatmana prashantasya paramatma samahitah. Sitoshana sukha dukheshu tatha manapanayo. For one who has conquered his mind, for him God is already reached. For him, heat and cold, joy and sorrow, honor and dishonor, social isolation and social contact, they are all the same. That is the state that you have to reach. So if you want to hear messages about being positive, thinking positive, please go somewhere else. You will find plenty of such platitudes and Pollyannas giving you lectures on being positive. It's not about being positive. It is about transcending the negative and the positive both. I often tell people, those who want to give up sorrow, put up your hands. And everyone puts their hands up. And I says, those who want to give up joy, put up your hands. Everybody puts their hands down. They even put their heads down. But you cannot give up sorrow without giving up joy. That is the message. Joy and sorrow are two sides of the coin. Don't try to grasp for joy, you will get sorrow. Don't try to grasp the positive, you will find the negative. Learn to transcend both the positive and the negative. That is true spirituality.
So learn to transcend. Dr. Shantanu, another question that we have is that, a lot of parents are asking about their children because, it's been almost 2 years that they, are physically not going anywhere. They're not going to school and they're staying in, they're not meeting their friends. So in terms of parenting, it's been a difficult time for all the parents out there. So what really can one do to make sure their children are not affected by social isolation?
So please, the message that I give all parents is, your children never listen to what you are saying because your actions are speaking so loudly. There is no point in instructing children. They are very intelligent and they see how you're behaving. You simply behave spiritually. Use adversity for spiritual progress, and your children will follow suit. They will follow suit. Your children will follow in your footsteps through your behavior, not through your instructions. You simply do what I'm telling you. And I assure you, the children that you bring up will be completely unique in this world because they will have learned how to cope with life. This world is a dukhalayam ashashvatam. This is a place of misery where nothing is permanent. This is a anityam sukham lokam. This is a world where everything is temporary and you cannot find lasting happiness. This is a world which is janma, mrityu, jara, vyadhi, dukha, doshanu, darshanam. Birth and death and old age and disease and fault and misfortune and unhappiness. They're all guaranteed to everybody. Just look around you. Instead of looking at your children, let them look to you. Let them see how you cope with adversity, and they will follow without your having to tell them. They will see, they will see you benefit, and they will follow in your footsteps.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Shantanu, you've of course mentioned that social isolation leads to mental health issues like anxiety, stress, depression. For those of us that are already suffering from it, or they were suffering earlier from it, and COVID has just exacerbated that. So, how what should one really do apart from, of course, the conventional scientific method? There are medicines available to counter that. But on a personal sphere, what can one do to kind of alleviate that stress a little bit?
The same thing that I have been saying all through the year on every Thursday, and I've said it again today. The self is the source of all your misery. Learn to transcend the self, to annihilate the self, to extinguish the self, to surrender the self. And the best way to do that is by remembering God. So remember God and forget self. And if you have some objection or you have some difficulty in remembering God, just forget the self. And all the techniques and methods that I am telling you and teaching you on these sessions that I conduct will help you to do that.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Shantanu. These were the questions that we had for this week. And if you want to add to the session, or if you want to tell us what you'll cover in the next session, please go ahead. We've got some time.
So these are not easy times. These are times of illness where every second, third, fourth person is suffering from COVID, where we are confined largely to our individual places of residence. And we are hoping that now things will open up. Remember that when you have an opportunity for social isolation, use this opportunity to work in a spirit of sacrifice and devotion to God without craving the fruit, without considering yourself to be the doer. And in your discretionary moments, use that opportunity to chant God's name. And you will find in a very short time, if you do what I'm saying. How short a time? 15 days, I'm asking you, only 15 days. If you can devote 2 hours to chanting in the morning, 2 hours to chanting in the evening, and everything that you do, you're offering to God with the idea Om Tat Sat, in 15 days, you will experience a difference. And I don't know how old you are, but I assure you that you will make more progress in this 15 days than all the years of your life so far. And if you find it doesn't work, please get in touch with me. Hari Om.
Thank you. Hari Om. Hare Krishna. Thank you. See you next week. Thank you.